The woman spoke. The next questions I have for you concern the arts. The woman paused and then spoke again. What do you have to say about the epic format in literature and in the arts? The tender responded. The epic format recognizes depth and breadth. It necessitates consideration. It gives space for interconnectedness to be explored, for hierarchies to be recognized, for trajectories to emerge. More fundamentally, the format of a work reflects the work's intention. The intention is to recognize and manifest the epic itself. It is to actively focus the attention on that which is richest, that which has the most to offer. The epic work represents ambition. The artist must broaden his view to see the strands of influence at play. To encompass the epic is to widen the parameters of consideration so that complexity may be unpacked, so that the sources of complication may be seen, so that their implications may be followed. But the epic work doesn't necessarily achieve its potential. Where the epic work directs itself to unpack the mundane, it represents ambition only in format and not in intention. To apply the epic format to the mundane, therefore, is to disrespect the format, to disrespect what the format itself asks for. The focus on the epic in the true case is the pursuit of the artist to know all that is relevant, and that is the pursuit for enlightenment, the direct experience of all that is at play. The epic requires its creator to invest himself towards total understanding. The epic also requires investment from viewers, listeners, and readers. The work is a microcosm representing a macrocosm. It must be looked into and unpacked. It is a universe of its own, made itself from an explosion over time out of an ambitious mind. Ambition is the reach. It is the trait of the stern. The greatest ambition is total excellence, total knowledge, total beauty. It is to seek to manifest that which is most difficult to manifest, that which requires the most to manifest. The greatest ambition is not to be the richest in gold, nor to be the most influential within a current of relatively pallid, subjective endeavor. The greatest ambition is to achieve total potential, to extend the mind through disciplined imagination, not in any direction, but in a specific direction, the appreciation of objective beauty in its most fundamental form. It is to allow the self to be humbled in that appreciation sufficiently to allow the guiding of the mind to attend to the spreading of the influence of that beauty into physical fitness, intellectual fitness, and spiritual fitness. And the greatest ambition is to be so determined in that pursuit that to sacrifice it, even to compromise it, becomes impossible. But to accept that course is dangerous, because if the wrong course is chosen and then vehemently adhered to, then prior gains will be lost. The correctness of the ambition shows in the mind and in the body of the adherent, and it shows in the result of his effort, in what the work strives for. Thus the creator of the epic must himself be epic. He must embody the spirit of the epic. He must embody the complexity of the epic and the lessons learned through its manifestation. The work is the measure of his own experience, his own battles, his own explorations, his own successes and failures. The epic work is a reflection of what its maker has known. It is the evidence that depicts his consideration. The epic needn't be long, but it must explore with the intent of total representation. Bach's Goldberg Variations is not long, but it is epic. The quintet in Meistersinger is not long, but it is epic. The moment when Wotan calls Brunhilde his brave, beautiful daughter is epic, but it doesn't take long. And yet it does, for it represents all that came before and is the seed of all that comes after, the necessary rise of the heroic in man that it may breach the wall of fire, man's own fear of the sublime, man's own fear that he may actually be forced to know himself. The epic confronts. It doesn't allow escape. Strands become apparent, and consequences result from pursuit. Strands must be chosen, but to be chosen, what they entail, their content, the sources of the influence they contain must be known. To be epic, therefore, is reliant upon reach rather than simply its manifested size. And yet the manifested size itself has potential value as a force magnifier. This is due to the potential immersion to be found in the experience of the epic format. The epic format encourages immersion. It is not a flash. It is something that can be unpacked, and through immersion the receiver of the work is given the time and the space for the unpacking. The immersion prevents the imposition of distraction. It allows empathetic consideration to emerge. It does not ask to be quickly forgotten. It asks for depths to be uncovered. Ultimately, the epic is epic as a result of what it entails, what it asks for, what it has the potential to unpack and expose. The true epic must therefore be profound in intention and sufficient in body to convey. The woman spoke. What do you have to say about Bach? The tender responded. I am not a scholar of others. My habit has been to hear beauty where I find it, and then to use that beauty as a guidepost in my own direct pursuit of the manifestation of that beauty. That is to say that I know Bach to be the greatest of all musical composers, and I have spent entire years of my life listening to certain of his works alone, and I have heard his music played on a solo violin in a tiny backstreet medieval chapel in Paris by one of France's most skilled performers. But while I own an excellent biography of Bach, Music in the Kingdom of Heaven, I have not read it. That is not to say I know nothing about him. Everything about Bach was epic. His childhood in a family of musicians was epic for the immersion it gave him in music, the language that was to be his own. He was steeped in the most studied of musical language from his birth. Furthermore, that world of music was aligned primarily with the expression of beauty, in their case in the language of the Lutheran Church, in the glory of God, the divine. So whether or not one recognizes value in the ins and outs of the Christian tradition, Bach's perfect language was applied to convey the most perfect energy he could conceive to convey. In the end, his music was not limited to the context of directly representing the very best of the Christian tradition. His music extended into abstraction, into the forms of energy themselves. Bach went beyond the tradition which he so dedicatedly served. He looked beyond the church to the angels themselves, to the mathematical precision of the universal forms. He tapped into the pure, into the underlying design of life, and that alone conveys that to him the sacred in its purest form was to be found in a deeper place than the church, in a deeper place than the written Gospels he so sensitively conveyed. The sacred was to be found in the direct personal experience of the Holy Spirit itself, the Spirit that was itself the wellspring of all truly heroic narratives ever conveyed by man. The woman spoke. What do you have to say about Thomas Malory and Wolfram von Eschenbach and the German and Icelandic stories? The tender responded. The works of Malory and von Eschenbach and the sagas and Eddas and other stories like them represent the expressions of the last and the most advanced of innate man. Through these stories we can see the ancient strains that guide us, the format of societies, the appearance of honor and dignity, and of the cunning and of the corrupted. They bear stories of men and the simple struggle within the course of life. They show how events of influence may unfold over generations. They show those forces as triggered by gods, the sources of influence, and carried out by men and women, bearing the will of those gods, manifesting that will in the world, setting in course their consequences. They present tapestries of living worlds with competing forces, competing interests, from the superficial to the profound. And because the profound is allowed, the superficial is lost in the context. The epic format of these works provokes confrontation with context, confrontation with the consideration of the interconnection, and thus the contagion of the effects of actions in the world. In today's society, man struggles to see beyond the immediate. There is so much that confronts him, that insists upon his attention, that he must fixate on whatever it is that is in front of him at the moment. Within the currents of that pattern, man comes to see his ability to excel at focused fixation as a good in and of itself. He brags about his ability to focus only upon that which he can control. He understands his happiness to be dependent on being able to let go of, and be at peace with the letting go of, all that is not directly before him. Man thus owns and reinforces his own compartmentalization. He grows into that compartmentalization and then takes pride in excelling in that context. He pleases the compartmentalization by becoming its slave, by being trusted to argue on behalf of the shackles, to wear the shackles as a badge of honor. And gradually his eyes fall from the sky, and he forgets how many stars were once visible. He forgets that the sound of birds once filled the air outside. The old epics allow for no fixation on detail. They breeze over individual lives in their focus on strands of influence, living manifestations of intent that carry lifespans that encompass generations, the arising and passing of tribes. In Mallory is the breadth of life, and it is a far better read than the cobbled together and bitterly argued Bible, itself the work of disconnected and by no means consistent authors. And yet Le Morte d'Arthur is a Christian work. Arthur's court is the attempt to create heaven on earth. It is the decision of the brotherhood to be the best that they can be, to seek without fear the will of God. And so the knights hear mass in the forest, at lonely hermitages, and at remote chapels while questing. They are tested for their adherence to their holy purpose and to their knightly honor, their own dignity of representation on earth. And all but 3 fall short, proving and accepting, yet taking no joy in, the failure of man. Those that achieve the grail are pure in their intent. They harbor no will at all for the profane. They manifest the sublime for all to see and honor. And yet their will is not to remain. They have the taste of heaven upon their lips, and so they take their time amongst men, but seem distant and cruel while also perfect. But then when it is time, as soon as it is time, they take to the boat and leave. Mallory retains and conveys the mystical through his representation of the Christian tradition. The work represents the mixture of the pagan experience of nature with the refined striving of the Christian warrior to be perfect. The time depicted is after the fall of Rome. Rome brought Christianity to its reaches, and then within 100 years Rome's reach in Europe evaporated. Over hundreds of years, kingdoms arose out of tribes in the vacuum. They grew out of animist roots into a Christian structure that no longer knew the works of Greece. But the Christian church at that stage was still itself nascent and imbued with magic, which is to say, the workings of the Holy Ghost in the lives of men. The mysteries remained, and thus the notion of the miraculous survived, and so therefore did the serving of abstract will through the embodiment of actions designed to please the arcs of stories in which they played but passing roles. The woman spoke. "What do you have to say about Wagner?" The tender responded, "As with Bach, I am not a scholar of the life of Richard Wagner. I have scanned summaries of his biography. And yet, just as I consider Bach through his music alone to be the greatest of composers, so too do I consider myself Wagnerian. I recognize his music to represent the embodied form of the repercussion of the ingestion of what Bach heard. Wagner feeds the will. That is his danger, some would claim. But what does he threaten? What does he put at risk? What does he strengthen? What is weakened when that strengthening is achieved? Wagner portrays a lived experience. He is not bound by the stultifying, limited potential of the gospel stories as Bach was with his masses, which were sublime to the extent allowed by the limited scope of the source text he was contracted to convey. Bach's perfection was in his music and in his intent, but he, like pristine Hildegard, lived in a world more strictly conditioned. In this sense alone, Wagner spread his wings wider. Where Bach and Hildegard demonstrated the voices of angels, Wagner represented the voices of men in pursuit of those angels and in battle with the representatives of darkness. That same darkness that is always ready to swallow man's will, his ability to follow his true course to God. Fully ensconced in the beginnings of the modern world, Wagner saw the risk of the loss of the epic stories and the distraction of man from their lessons. He pleaded for the retention of the pure line of their expression, the recognition of the heroic element in man, which may first and foremost be seen in the expression of divine art, the natural-born song of an artisan of the tribe, the sound of the fields and forest, the life of the animals known, the experience of love. Wagner's heroes are fallible and yet bold. they struggle and they tend not to win. But in losing, they retain the purity of their intent. They will always lose rather than succumb to the wicked or to the low-minded. But being direct and naturally noble of mind, they do not recognize intrigue and so are vulnerable. Wagner's music and his choice of stories and his articulation of them are all epic, challenging, sublime both in their intent and manifestation. And the last of them, Parsifal, the story of the Christian knight, is a spiritual experience all on its own.